quiet question about respect. Have you ever sat at a dinner table, surrounded by people you love, and still felt strangely invisible? Not angry, not dramatic, just unseen. Maybe you're learning English, trying to improve your life, trying not to give up, yet something inside you keeps whispering, "Why does this feel so hard?" This video is not just about English. It's about respect, about marriage, about family, and about the quiet moments that slowly decide whether you keep going or slowly fade. 3 weeks ago, in the United States, I started asking myself a question that felt uncomfortable but honest. Do I feel respected in my marriage? Not loved. Not supported financially. Respected. That word sounds simple, but it's heavy. Respect is quiet. It's not flowers or big promises. It's how someone listens when you speak slowly. It's how they don't interrupt you, especially when your English is not perfect. You might think this is strange for an English practice video. But stay with me. Because the brain learns best when emotions are involved. Neuroscience shows that when a story connects to personal pain or hope, the brain releases dopamine. Dopamine helps memory. That's why you still remember arguments from years ago, but forget vocabulary from yesterday. I didn't come to the US planning to question my marriage. I came thinking about stability, about my children, about building something better. Like many people, I told myself, just endure a little. Things will improve. But endurance without respect slowly becomes exhaustion. And exhaustion is the enemy of learning anything, especially a new language. Let me speak slowly here. Respect is not agreement. Respect is not silence. Respect is feeling safe to be yourself, even when you're tired, confused, or speaking broken English. One evening, after a long day, my partner corrected my English in front of our children. The correction was not wrong. The tone was. It was fast, sharp, public. The kids laughed, not to be cruel, just because children follow energy. And in that moment, something small cracked inside me. Not my confidence in English. My confidence as an equal. Psychologists call this micro-disrespect. Small moments. No shouting. No abuse. Just tiny signals that say, I'm above you. Over time, the brain records these signals as threat. When the brain senses threat, it activates the amygdala, the fear center. And when the amygdala is active, learning shuts down. That's why when you feel judged, your English disappears. Your mind goes blank. It's not stupidity. It's biology. You may recognize this. You open an English video. You want to practice listening, but your chest feels tight. Your mind wanders. You replay conversations in your head. You're not lazy. Your nervous system is overloaded. That night, after the kids went to sleep, I sat alone and practiced English quietly. Just whispering sentences. I deserve respect. I want to be heard. My voice matters. Simple sentences. Basic English. But emotionally heavy. This is something language teachers rarely tell you. Repeating meaningful sentences trains the brain faster than repeating random ones. Emotional relevance creates stronger neural pathways. That is science, not motivation talk. As I practiced, I realized something painful but freeing. I had been using English learning as a way to escape my feelings. I told myself, if I speak better, they will respect me. But respect doesn't start with grammar. It starts with boundaries. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Sometimes, people don't disrespect us because we're weak. They do it because we've been silent for too long. Silence teaches others how to treat us. This is where marriage equality becomes real, not in laws or speeches, but in everyday tone. In eye contact, in patience, in letting someone finish a slow sentence without rushing them. If you're listening to this and thinking, this feels like my life, you're not alone. Many people trying to improve themselves, through English, work or parenting, are carrying invisible emotional weight. And that weight slows everything down. But awareness is the first shift. When you name the problem, the brain moves from chaos to clarity. You regain a little control. So let me ask you, quietly, honestly, do you feel respected where you are right now? Because once you hear that question clearly, you can't unhear it. And that's where real change, both in language and in life, begins. 3 weeks that changed everything. Imagine moving through your day like you're carrying a glass of water filled to the edge. One small bump, one careless word, and it spills everywhere. That's what the last 3 weeks in the US felt like for me. Nothing exploded. No dramatic fights. Just a steady drip of pressure, from marriage, from parenting, from trying to sound confident in a language that still feels borrowed. 3 weeks is not a long time. But psychology tells us the brain doesn't measure time in calendars. It measures change. And these weeks were full of it. New routines. New expectations. The kind that quietly rearrange power inside a relationship. Every morning started the same. Coffee cooling on the counter. Kids asking questions too fast. English floating around the house like background noise. News, phone calls, casual jokes I half understood. My brain was always translating, always catching up. That constant effort matters. Cognitive scientists call this mental load. When you operate in a second language, your brain burns more glucose just to stay functional. Add emotional stress, and your system runs on emergency mode. In emergency mode, people become impatient, including the ones you love. At first, I blamed myself. That's a common reflex. When something feels unequal, the brain looks inward before outward. Maybe I'm too sensitive. Maybe I should try harder. Maybe when my English improves, this tension will disappear. This is called internal attribution bias, assuming you're the problem because it feels safer than questioning the relationship. But then small patterns started to appear. Decisions were made quickly. I was informed, not consulted. When I hesitated, because I needed time to process in English, the conversation moved on without me. Not intentionally cruel, just efficient. And efficiency, when repeated, slowly erases equality. Here's something no one tells you about marriage under stress. Inequality often hides behind practicality. Someone speaks faster, decides faster, adapts faster. Over time, speed becomes power. One afternoon, while driving, my partner said, "It's easier if I just handle this." The sentence sounded helpful, but my body reacted before my mind did. Tight shoulders. Shallow breath. That's your nervous system recognizing loss of agency. Research shows that when people feel excluded from decision-making, cortisol, the stress hormone, rises. High cortisol blocks the hippocampus, the part of the brain responsible for learning and memory. So if you're wondering why your English listening feels worse when your life feels heavy, this is why. I tried to ignore it. I focused on my children. Kids are emotional mirrors. They don't analyze power dynamics, but they feel them. When they saw me pause before speaking, they interrupted more. Not out of disrespect, out of imitation. Children copy the loudest energy in the room. That realization hurt more than any argument. At night, I practiced English like a secret rebellion. Slow sentences. Clear pronunciation. Not to impress anyone, but to remind myself that my voice still existed. Linguists say speaking out loud activates self-regulation pathways in the brain. It calms you, grounds you, even if no one else is listening. During those 3 weeks, I also noticed something subtle. When I spoke confidently, even with simple English, the dynamic shifted slightly. Not magically, but Not because your grammar improves, but because your posture does. Still, confidence without honesty becomes performance. And I was tired of performing. There was a moment, standing in the kitchen late evening, when I realized this wasn't about language at all. English was just the stage. The real story was about equality. About whether both adults in a marriage are allowed to be slow sometimes, confused sometimes, human. Sociologists describe equality not as sameness, but as mutual consideration. That means both people adjust. Both people wait. Both people listen. When only one adapts, imbalance grows quietly. These 3 weeks taught me something uncomfortable. Love can exist without equality. Families can function without respect. But growth cannot. Learning cannot. And eventually, neither can peace. If you're learning English while carrying family pressure, you're doing something incredibly demanding. You're asking your brain to grow while your heart is under strain. That's not weakness. That's courage, misunderstood. So if progress feels slow, don't shame yourself. Ask a better question. Where in my life am I rushing to adapt, while no one is slowing down for me? Because language learning doesn't fail first. People do, by ignoring what their body has been signaling all along. And once you notice that signal, you're already closer to change than you think. Love feels unequal sometimes. There's a strange moment in every long relationship when you realize love and equality are not the same thing. Love can be warm, familiar, even comforting, while inequality quietly sits in the corner, saying nothing, doing damage. You don't notice it all at once. You feel it in your body before you can explain it in words. For me, that realization came during an ordinary morning. No arguments. No raised voices. Just a list of tasks being divided, quickly, efficiently. Some tasks were mine. Others were handled already. I nodded, like I always did. But inside, something resisted. Not the work. The assumption. Psychologists call this role drift. Over time, couples slowly slide into fixed roles without ever agreeing to them. One becomes the decider. The other becomes the supporter. It feels natural, until it doesn't. And when you're living in a second language, role drift accelerates. The person who speaks faster often leads, not because they're wiser, but because they're quicker. I loved my partner. That wasn't the question. The question was harder. Was I still an equal participant in my own marriage? Here's where English learning quietly connects. When you don't fully trust your language, you hesitate. That hesitation is misread as uncertainty, or worse, disinterest. Over time, people stop asking for your opinion. Not out of malice, but out of habit. The brain loves shortcuts. Neuroscience shows that humans naturally assign authority to those who respond fastest. Speed signals competence. Slowness is unfairly labeled weakness. But learning a language requires slowness. Thinking in English takes time. And time, in an unequal dynamic, is rarely granted. I noticed how often I edited myself, shortened my sentences, simplified my thoughts, not for clarity, but to avoid interrupting the flow. That's not communication. That's self-erasure. One evening, I practiced a simple English phrase. I'd like to finish my thought. Not aggressive. Not emotional. Just clear. Saying it out loud felt strange. Powerful. Almost rebellious. Language is not just a tool for expressing ideas. It's a tool for protecting space. Linguists call this pragmatic competence, knowing how to use language to manage relationships, not just grammar. When I finally used that sentence in real life, my voice shook. But something important happened. The conversation slowed. Just a little. Enough for me to exist inside it. Equality doesn't arrive with a speech. It arrives with small interruptions of old patterns. There's a myth that strong marriages never feel unequal. That's false. Strong marriages notice inequality early. Weak ones deny it politely. I began observing instead of accusing. When decisions were made without me, I noted how it felt in my body. Tight jaw. Shallow breath. Those signals matter. The body detects imbalance before the mind justifies it away. This awareness changed how I learned English too. I stopped chasing perfection. I focused on presence. Clear, slow sentences. Honest tone. Studies show that people perceive speakers as more trustworthy when they speak slightly slower with intentional pauses. Slowness, when owned, becomes authority. That's a powerful lesson for both language and marriage. If you're learning English, you don't need to sound native to be equal. You need to sound self-respecting. Respect starts with how you allow others to treat your pauses. Love without equality feels like standing on one leg. You can balance, for a while. But eventually, you get tired. And tired people stop growing. So here is a quiet reflection for you. Where in your life have you been grateful for love, but hungry for respect? Naming that hunger doesn't make you ungrateful. It makes you honest. And honesty, even in simple English, is where balance begins.
Small words, big damage.
Words don't need to be loud to hurt. Some of the most damaging ones arrive calmly, wearing polite smiles. They sound reasonable, helpful, even. That's what makes them dangerous. They slip past your defenses and settle somewhere deep, where you don't argue with them, you absorb them. It was a small sentence that stayed with me. Let me explain it better. Grammatically perfect. Socially acceptable. Emotionally heavy. The moment it was said, my brain reacted before my heart caught up. A slight heat in the face.
A pause too long.
That reaction has a name. Psychologists call it status threat. When someone subtly positions themselves as the authority and you as the student, the nervous system registers hierarchy. Hierarchy is not partnership. In marriages, small verbal cues accumulate.
Tone.
Timing. Who corrects whom, and in front of whom. Linguistic research shows that public correction increases shame responses, especially in second language speakers. Shame doesn't motivate improvement. It shuts people down. That night, I replayed the sentence in my head, not in English but in feeling. It wasn't about information. It was about positioning. About who leads and who follows. Here's the cruel irony. When you're learning English, people think correcting you is kindness. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it's control, disguised as support. The difference is consent. Were you invited to be corrected, or were you interrupted? I began noticing how often my sentences were finished for me. Not because I was wrong, but because I was slow. Speed again. Always speed. Cognitive science tells us the brain hates unfinished patterns. When someone pauses too long, listeners feel discomfort and rush to complete the thought. This is called closure bias. In relationships with equality, people tolerate that discomfort. In unequal ones, they erase the pause. I started experimenting. When interrupted, I didn't rush. I paused longer. Maintained eye contact. Finished my sentence anyway. It felt awkward. Powerful. Like reclaiming stolen time. At first, the response was confusion.
Then Irritation.
Then, something interesting, adjustment. Small words can damage, but small changes can heal. I practiced another English sentence. Please don't correct me right now. Simple.
Direct.
Respectful. Boundary-setting language reduces emotional escalation, according to conflict psychology. It gives the other person a choice instead of an accusation. When I used it, my voice didn't shake this time. Here's what surprised me most. The moment I stopped accepting small disrespect, my motivation to learn English increased. Not because the language became easier, but because my nervous system felt safer. Safety accelerates learning. That's not inspiration, that's neuroscience. If you feel stuck in English, ask yourself a different question. Who are you learning for? Approval or expression? Because when your words are constantly corrected, your mind learns to stay quiet.
And quiet minds don't grow.
Small words can shrink a person, or they can wake them up. The difference is whether you let them pass without question. Children see more than we think. Children have a strange superpower. They don't listen carefully, but they observe perfectly. You can explain respect to them for hours, but they will learn more in 5 seconds by watching how you speak to your partner. Especially when things are tense. Especially when no one thinks they're paying attention. I learned this the uncomfortable way. One afternoon, we were all in the living room. Nothing special. Just noise, toys, unfinished conversations. I started to say something, slowly, carefully, choosing my English words in my head. Halfway through my sentence, I paused.
Just a second too long.
My partner jumped in and finished the thought. Again, not angrily. Efficiently. Before I could react, my child copied it. They spoke over me. Confident. Loud. Casual. As if it were the most normal thing in the world. And in that moment, I didn't feel disrespected as a spouse. I felt exposed as a parent. Developmental psychology explains this clearly. Children don't learn values from explanations. They learn from patterns. By the age of 6 or 7, they've already absorbed who leads, who waits, who gets interrupted, and who apologizes for taking space. This process is called social mirroring. It's automatic. And it's relentless. I realized I had been teaching my children something without ever meaning to, that my voice was optional. That night, I couldn't focus on my English practice. My mind kept replaying the scene. The pause. The interruption. The imitation. This is where family stress and language learning collide. When emotions spike, the brain's prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for focus and learning, goes offline. You can stare at English words for an hour and retain nothing. Not because you're lazy. Because your nervous system is busy protecting you. So instead of forcing myself to study, I reflected. Why had I stayed quiet so often?
Not out of fear.
Out of politeness. Out out of wanting to keep peace. But peace built on self-erasure doesn't feel peaceful to the body. It feels like tension without sound. The next day, I tried something small. Intentionally small. When my child answered for me again, I didn't rush. I didn't smile it away. I looked at them gently and said, slowly, clearly, in simple English, "Thank you." I was still speaking.
No anger. No lecture. Just presence.
Something interesting happened. My child froze for a second, confused. Not hurt. Not scared. Just recalibrating. Children adjust faster than adults when the signal is clear. This is important for English learners. Clear boundaries don't require advanced vocabulary. They require calm tone and steady pacing. Research in communication psychology shows that low volume, slow speech increases perceived authority more than loud or emotional speech. Slowness, when intentional, communicates confidence. That moment became a turning point. I began practicing English with my children, not separately from them. Not lessons. Just shared moments. Simple storytelling. Describing the day. Naming feelings. Studies show that children who witness parents learning something new develop stronger growth mindsets. They associate effort with normal life, not failure. But the deeper change was in how I showed up in conversations. I stopped apologizing for my pauses.
I let silence exist.
Silence is uncomfortable, but only at first. In family systems theory, silence often reveals hidden power dynamics. Whoever rushes to fill it usually holds less power. Whoever allows it often holds more. By allowing my pauses, I was quietly shifting the balance. My children noticed. They began waiting.
Interrupting less.
Asking more questions. Not because I demanded it, but because the pattern changed. Here's the science behind that. Children regulate their nervous systems through adult behavior. When they see calm boundaries, their stress hormones drop. Lower stress improves attention, memory, and emotional regulation. Equality between parents isn't just ethical, it's neurologically stabilizing for children. And that brings us back to marriage. When one parent consistently defers, children feel the imbalance even if they can't name it. That imbalance creates background anxiety. And anxious children often act out, not because they're misbehaving, but because the system feels unstable. Equality is not about winning arguments. It's about creating an environment where everyone's voice feels expected, not surprising. If you're learning English while raising children, remember this: your pauses are not weaknesses. They are demonstrations of thoughtfulness. You are modeling patience, self-respect, and emotional regulation, all while practicing a new language. And maybe the most important sentence you can say, slowly, clearly, without apology, is this: please wait. I'm thinking. Because when your children learn to wait for you, they're learning something far more valuable than English. They're learning respect. Silence is not peace.
Silence looks peaceful from the outside.
No arguing. No tension you can point to. Just people moving around each other carefully, like furniture placed too close together. But inside the body, silence often sounds like alarm bells muted with a pillow. I used to think silence meant maturity. I told myself, not everything needs to be said. That sounds wise.
It sounds adult.
It even sounds loving. But over the past 3 weeks, I learned something uncomfortable. Silence in a marriage is rarely neutral. It usually means someone is shrinking to keep things stable. And shrinking is exhausting. The human brain is wired for expression. When we suppress thoughts repeatedly, the nervous system doesn't relax. It tightens. Neuroscientists explain this through emotional inhibition. When emotions are blocked, the body stays in a low-level stress response. Heart rate slightly elevated. Muscles subtly tense. Focus reduced. Learning impaired. That explains something important. During the quietest days in my marriage, my English felt the hardest. I would sit with a simple listening exercise. Slow audio. Clear pronunciation. But my mind drifted. Words passed through me like fog. This wasn't a language problem. It was a safety problem. The brain doesn't absorb new information when it's busy monitoring emotional threat. Silence sends a confusing signal to the brain. Everything looks calm, but something feels wrong. That uncertainty is stressful. Psychologists call it ambiguous threat. And ambiguous threat is more draining than open conflict. One evening, after another long quiet day, my partner asked, "Are you okay?" I said, "Yes." That was the lie. Not a dramatic lie.
A practical one.
The kind you tell to keep dinner moving. But here's the thing about silence. It trains everyone around you. When you say, "I'm fine" too many times, people stop checking. Not because they don't care, but because you've taught them that quiet equals okay. That's how equality slowly dissolves. In marriage research, there's a concept called emotional labor imbalance. One person manages the emotional atmosphere by absorbing discomfort. They stay quiet. They smooth things over. They keep peace. Over time, this person becomes invisible, not intentionally erased, but quietly sidelined. I realized I had become very good at swallowing words. Why? Because speaking felt risky.
Not dangerous, just inconvenient.
It slowed things down. It introduced discomfort. And when you're already navigating a second language, discomfort feels amplified. But silence has a cost. The cost is resentment without release. And resentment leaks. It shows up as fatigue,
as irritation at small things,
as loss of motivation, as that voice in your head saying, "Why bother?" Language learning suffers first. Always. Cognitive psychology shows that motivation depends on perceived agency, the feeling that your actions matter. When your voice doesn't change outcomes at home, your brain starts questioning effort everywhere else, including English practice.
That is when I understood something crucial.
Silence wasn't protecting my marriage. It was quietly training me to disappear. So I tried something different.
Not a confrontation.
Not a speech. Just one honest sentence. I don't feel heard. Simple English.
No accusations. No explanations.
Just a feeling. My voice was calm. My hands were shaking. The response wasn't perfect. There was confusion, defensiveness, a pause. But something important happened. The silence broke. And when silence breaks, reality enters the room. Reality is uncomfortable, but it's also workable. Here's the science behind that moment. Naming emotions activates the prefrontal cortex and reduces activity in the amygdala. This process is called affect labeling. It literally calms the brain. Silence does the opposite. It lets fear grow without shape. After that conversation, my English practice changed. Not instantly, but noticeably. I could focus longer, retain more,
speak with less hesitation.
Because my nervous system wasn't holding everything in. Peace is not the absence of noise. Peace is the presence of safety. And safety doesn't come from silence. It comes from knowing you can speak and still belong. If you're quiet in your marriage and struggling with English, don't assume these are separate problems. They're connected by the same system, your sense of agency. You don't need perfect words. You don't need fluent grammar. You need permission to yourself to take up space. Sometimes, the bravest English sentence you can practice is not complicated at all. I need to say something. Because once silence ends, learning can finally begin. Learning English while breaking down. There's a moment when learning English stops feeling like growth and starts feeling like survival. You're not excited anymore. You're just trying not to quit. Not the language, life. That moment arrived for me quietly, during the 3rd week in the US, when everything felt heavy but nothing looked wrong. On the surface, I was still doing the right things. Listening to slow English audio. Repeating sentences. Practicing pronunciation. But inside, my mind was collapsing in slow motion. Words blurred. Motivation leaked out through invisible cracks. And I kept asking myself the wrong question: what's wrong with my English? Nothing was wrong with my English. What was breaking was my emotional bandwidth. Neuroscience explains this brutally well. The brain has limited cognitive resources. When emotional stress is high, especially unresolved stress from relationships, the brain reallocates energy away from learning and toward threat management. That's not a mindset problem. That's biology. Your brain is choosing survival over vocabulary. I remember sitting alone, headphones on, listening to a simple conversation in English. Words I already knew. Sentences I could understand yesterday. But my chest felt tight. My thoughts wandered. I replayed family moments instead of focusing on sound. This phenomenon is called cognitive intrusion. Emotional concerns hijack attention. You're not distracted, you're overloaded. And here's the cruel part. When learning becomes harder, people blame themselves. They push more. Force longer study sessions. Add pressure. Which increases stress. Which makes learning even worse. That's the downward spiral. I realized I wasn't failing at English. I was trying to learn while emotionally unsafe. Marriage stress changes how the brain processes language. Studies show that chronic interpersonal stress reduces working memory capacity. Working memory is essential for language learning. It's what allows you to hold a sentence in your head long enough to understand it. When working memory shrinks, English feels faster, harder, more hostile. That's why English suddenly sounded aggressive to me. Not because people were rude, but because my nervous system was already braced for impact. One night, instead of practicing grammar, I did something different. I spoke English about my breakdown. Out loud. Slowly. To no one. I feel tired. I feel invisible. I am learning, but I am not okay. These were not advanced sentences, but they were honest. Psychologists call this expressive labeling. When you put internal states into words, even simple ones, the brain reduces emotional intensity. Language becomes regulation, not performance. Something shifted. The next day, I changed how I practiced English. I stopped chasing fluency. I chased safety. Short sessions. Slow pace. Meaningful content. Research in adult learning confirms this. Emotionally relevant material improves retention more than neutral drills. I also noticed something important. When I practiced English after moments of emotional clarity, even small ones, I learned faster. When I practiced after swallowing feelings, I learned almost nothing. Your brain remembers how you feel while learning. If learning is paired with self-erasure, the brain resists it. If learning is paired with self-respect, the brain leans in. This is why so many people fail at English after years of effort. Not because they lack discipline, but because their lives are silently draining them. Marriage pressure, parenting stress, financial fear, identity loss.
These don't stay outside your study time.
They sit next to you. They listen with you. They interfere. And here's the uncomfortable truth. No amount of motivation can override chronic emotional imbalance. Motivation is a short-term chemical. Safety is a long-term condition. Once I understood this, I stopped punishing myself. I redesigned my learning environment. Emotionally first. Linguistically second. I practiced English when I felt calm, even if that meant less total time. I spoke slower, without apologizing. I chose sentences that reflected my reality, not textbook fantasies. And slowly, my English came back. Not because my life suddenly improved, but because I stopped asking my brain to perform while it was hurting. If you're struggling to learn English right now, ask yourself something different. Where am I emotionally holding my breath? Because language doesn't grow in held breath. It grows in exhale. You don't need to push harder. You need to feel safer. And sometimes the bravest step in learning English is admitting, clearly, simply, without shame, I'm not okay right now. That sentence is not weakness. It's alignment. And alignment is where real learning resumes. What equality really means. Equality sounds like a big word. Heavy. Political. Abstract. But in marriage, equality is painfully ordinary. It shows up in pauses, not speeches. In who gets time to think. In whose confusion is allowed without punishment. I didn't understand that until the past 3 weeks forced me to look closely at my relationship, at myself, and at the quiet agreements we never made but somehow lived by. I used to think equality meant splitting tasks. 50-50. Fair on paper. But real life doesn't run on spreadsheets. Equality in marriage is not about math. It's about mutual consideration. Who adjusts when things are uncomfortable? Who slows down when the other struggles? In our case, the answer had been obvious, but unspoken. I was the one adapting to a new country, to a second language, to emotional shifts I didn't fully understand.
Adaptation feels noble at first.
You tell yourself you're being flexible, supportive, mature. But over time, adaptation without reciprocity becomes erasure. Psychologists call this asymmetrical accommodation. One partner consistently adjusts their needs to maintain harmony, while the other maintains default settings.
No villain. No intention.
Just imbalance growing quietly. And imbalance doesn't announce itself. It whispers. Through decisions made quickly. Through jokes you're supposed to laugh at. Through conversations that move on before you're ready. I realized equality wasn't missing because of cruelty. It was missing because of speed. Speed favors the confident.
Speed favors the fluent.
Speed favors the person who doesn't need to translate feelings before expressing them. Slowness, in contrast, needs protection. This is where English learning and marriage intersect again. Learning a language forces you into slowness. You pause. You search. You hesitate. In an equal relationship, slowness is respected. In an unequal one, it's bypassed. Once I saw this, I stopped asking, "Do they respect me?" and started asking, "Do we protect each other's slowness?" That question changed everything. One evening, I deliberately took my time speaking. I didn't rush to keep up.
I let silence stretch.
The discomfort was immediate. Silence makes people nervous. But silence also reveals patterns. Who fills it? Who interrupts? Who waits? When I finished my thought, calm, slow, clear, I noticed something subtle. The conversation felt different. Heavier. More real. Not smoother. More honest. Equality creates friction at first. Because it interrupts habit. Marriage researchers talk about homeostasis. Relationships resist change, even healthy change. When one person stops adapting automatically, the system destabilizes briefly. That doesn't mean you're doing something wrong. It means the balance is recalibrating. This insight helped me stop panicking when things felt awkward. Awkwardness was not failure. It was adjustment. I also redefined my English goals. Instead of sound natural, my new goal became sound present. Presence matters more than fluency. Studies show that listeners perceive speakers who maintain steady pace and eye contact as more credible, even with limited vocabulary. Presence is equality in action. Here's what equality is not. It's not winning arguments. It's not always being understood. It's not avoiding conflict. Equality is knowing that your confusion will not be used against you. That your learning curve is not a burden. That your pauses are allowed to exist without someone rushing past them. Once I embodied this, something shifted internally. My shoulders relaxed. My breathing deepened. And my English, quietly, improved. Because the brain learns best when it feels respected. If you're listening and thinking, I don't feel equal, but I don't want to fight, understand this. Equality doesn't start with confrontation. It starts with posture, with pacing, with choosing not to erase yourself for comfort. Sometimes the most equal sentence in English is not complex at all. I need a moment. That sentence creates space. And space is where both language and love can breathe. Equality is not loud. It doesn't announce itself. But once it enters a marriage, you feel it everywhere. In your voice. In your learning. In your sense of worth. And once you experience that, you can't go back to pretending silence was peace. One honest conversation. Most marriages don't change because of dramatic moments. They change because of one sentence said at the wrong or right time. Not perfectly. Not fluently. Just honestly. For me, everything shifted after one conversation I almost didn't start. It wasn't planned. That's important. Planned conversations come with scripts, defenses, and exit strategies. This one happened late in the evening, when the house was quiet enough to hear your own thoughts, and loud enough to scare you into silence. I stood there, feeling the familiar pressure in my chest. The urge to keep things smooth. To say nothing. To let another day pass. Silence had become a habit, and habits feel safe, even when they hurt. But my body said no. Psychologists talk about somatic markers, physical sensations that guide decisions when logic hesitates. Tight throat. Warm face. Shallow breath. These are not signs of weakness. They're signals that something important is being ignored. So I spoke. Slowly. Carefully. In simple English. I feel small lately. That was it. No blame. No history. No explanation. Just a feeling. The reaction was not what movies promise. There was confusion. A pause. Then defensiveness. Not shouting, just discomfort.
This is normal.
When established patterns are challenged, the brain reacts with threat responses. Marriage research calls this rupture. It's the moment when equilibrium breaks. And rupture feels awful. I wanted to take the sentence back. To apologize. To translate it into something softer. But I didn't. I stayed present. I breathed. I let the discomfort exist. That choice mattered more than the words. Here's why. When you stay regulated during emotional stress, your nervous system invites the other person's system to regulate too. This is called co-regulation. It's foundational to healthy relationships and to productive conversations. Slow speech helps with this. Lower volume helps. Short sentences help. You don't need advanced English to create emotional clarity. You need steadiness. After a long pause, my partner said something unexpected. Not agreement. Not denial. Just, I didn't know. That sentence opened a door. We didn't solve everything that night. There were misunderstandings. Defensive comments. Old habits trying to reassert themselves. But something important happened. I was no longer invisible in the conversation. Honesty had disrupted the pattern. From a psychological perspective, this matters. Studies show that couples who can tolerate emotional discomfort without escalation build stronger long-term trust. Trust doesn't grow from constant harmony. It grows from repair. And repair begins with naming reality. After that conversation, I noticed subtle changes. Decisions slowed. Questions were asked instead of assumed. Not always. Not perfectly. But enough to feel different. My English practice changed too. I started practicing conversations instead of vocabulary. Real sentences. Emotional sentences. I need time to think. That doesn't feel fair. Please listen. These are not dramatic phrases, but they're powerful. They create equality not by force, but by presence. There's also a neurological reason this helped. When emotional expression aligns with internal states, the brain experiences coherence. Coherence reduces cognitive load, freeing resources for learning. In simple terms, when you stop pretending, your brain has more energy. One honest conversation doesn't fix a marriage, but it reintroduces truth. And truth is oxygen. If you're afraid to speak honestly because your English isn't perfect, remember this. Perfection creates distance.
Honesty creates connection.
People respond to emotional accuracy more than grammatical accuracy.
You don't need the right accent.
You need the right alignment. If you're listening to this and thinking, I'm holding back something important, ask yourself what you're protecting. Peace or comfort? Because comfort fades. Peace built on truth lasts. The sentence that changed everything for me wasn't clever or fluent. It was human. And sometimes, that's all equality needs to begin. Tiny habits that restore respect. Big changes in marriage rarely come from big promises. They come from small, almost boring habits repeated when no one is watching. After that honest conversation, nothing magically improved. But something shifted quietly. The air felt different. And that difference was built, day by day, through tiny behaviors that rebuilt respect without announcing it. At first, I was waiting for proof. A dramatic apology.
A visible transformation.
That's what movies teach us to expect. Real life works differently. Respect doesn't arrive with fireworks. It arrives with consistency. Psychologists call this behavioral repair. After emotional rupture, trust is restored not through words, but through repeated actions that signal safety. The brain doesn't believe promises. It believes patterns. So I stopped listening for declarations and started watching for habits. One habit was surprisingly simple: waiting. When I spoke, and no one interrupted, my nervous system noticed. When decisions paused for my input, even briefly, my shoulders relaxed. These micro-moments mattered more than long discussions. Research shows that perceived inclusion in decision-making significantly reduces stress hormones, even if the outcome doesn't change. Another habit was tone. Not the words. The tone. Respect lives there. A neutral tone says, "You belong in this conversation." A rushed tone says, "Catch up or get out." Once I became aware of this, I noticed how sensitive my body was to tone, and how much tone affected my English. When the tone was calm, my vocabulary expanded. When it was sharp, my mind shrank. That's not emotional weakness. That's neurobiology. The brain mirrors the emotional environment it's in. Safe tone equals cognitive openness. I also changed my own habits. Equality isn't built by one person alone, even if imbalance isn't equally shared. I stopped over-explaining. Over-explaining is a common response to feeling undervalued. You add extra words to justify your right to speak. But over-explaining actually signals insecurity and invites interruption. Instead, I practiced concise English. Short sentences. Clear intent. Calm delivery. I disagree. I need more time. That doesn't work for me. These sentences felt uncomfortable at first. They lacked politeness cushions. But they were respectful because they were honest. Communication research confirms this. Clarity reduces conflict more effectively than excessive politeness. Another habit was eye contact. Not intense. Not confrontational. Just steady. Eye contact regulates turn-taking in conversation. It signals readiness and presence. When I maintained it during pauses, interruptions decreased. This wasn't manipulation. It was communication. We also adjusted family routines. Small ones. Shared check-ins. Slower decision-making when emotions were high. These habits didn't require perfect English. They required awareness. And here's the surprising part. As respect returned, my motivation to learn English returned with it. Not because I wanted approval, but because I felt worthy of expression. Motivation driven by self-respect lasts longer than motivation driven by fear. Fear creates urgency. Respect creates endurance. Learning research supports this. Adult learners progress faster when learning is tied to identity reinforcement rather than external validation. When English became a tool for expressing myself, not proving myself, I improved more naturally. If you're trying to rebuild respect in your relationship while learning English, start tiny. Not dramatic. Tiny. Pause instead of rushing. Finish your sentence. Don't apologize for thinking. Notice tone, yours and theirs. Choose clarity over comfort. These habits look small, but the brain notices them immediately. And once the brain feels respected, it cooperates. Respect is not a feeling. It's a pattern. And patterns, once established, change everything. Why your brain wants to quit. There comes a point in every difficult journey when your brain quietly suggests an escape. Not dramatically. Not with panic. Just a soft, reasonable thought. This isn't working. Maybe stop. If you've ever felt that while learning English, or while holding a marriage together, this part is for you. Your brain is not lazy. It's protective. I noticed this urge during the same weeks when everything felt heavy. I would open an English video, listen for 30 seconds, and suddenly feel tired. Not bored. Drained. My mind would offer alternatives. Check your phone, make coffee, do anything else. That wasn't lack of discipline. That was my nervous system trying to reduce load. Neuroscience explains this clearly. When stress becomes chronic, the brain prioritizes energy conservation. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for focus, planning and language processing, loses efficiency. The brain shifts control to more primitive systems that favor avoidance. This is called neural downshifting. In simple terms, your brain wants to quit to protect you. Marriage stress amplifies this effect. Studies show that unresolved interpersonal conflict increases cognitive fatigue, even when the conflict is quiet. Silent tension is especially exhausting because the brain keeps monitoring it without resolution. That constant monitoring consumes working memory, the same resource you need to process English sentences. So when you feel like you can't learn anymore, it's often because your brain is overloaded, not incapable. Here's where most people make a mistake. They fight the urge to quit with force.
More motivation.
More pressure. Longer study sessions. But pressure is interpreted by the brain as additional threat. Threat increases avoidance. It's like shouting at someone who's already overwhelmed. I realized something important when I stopped blaming myself. The urge to quit was information. It was my brain saying, "This environment doesn't feel safe enough for growth." Safety doesn't mean comfort. It means predictability, agency, and respect. Once I understood this, I changed strategy. Instead of pushing through resistance, I listened to it. When my brain wanted to quit, I asked why. Was I tired? Emotionally overloaded? Feeling unseen? Most of the time, the answer wasn't about English at all. So I adjusted the conditions. Shorter practice.
Slower pace.
Familiar topics.
No multitasking.
Research in cognitive load theory confirms this. Reducing extraneous load improves learning efficiency, especially under stress. I also normalized the quitting impulse. When you treat it as failure, shame follows. Shame further reduces cognitive capacity. But when you treat it as a signal, you regain control. This mindset shift alone improved my consistency. I also noticed how equality in my marriage affected my brain's behavior. On days when I felt included and respected, my focus returned naturally. On days when I felt minimized, English felt impossible. The brain tracks emotional status closely.
Social hierarchy activates survival circuits.
Feeling lower in status triggers vigilance and withdrawal. Equality calms those circuits. This explains why encouragement alone doesn't help if respect is missing. Motivation speeches don't override nervous system signals. The solution isn't to push harder. It's to make learning safer. Here's a practical reframing that helped me. When your brain wants to quit, don't ask, "How do I force myself?" Ask, "What would make this feel safer?" Sometimes the answer is rest. Sometimes it's honesty. Sometimes it's a boundary. Sometimes it's a slower sentence. The urge to quit doesn't mean you should stop. It means you should adjust. Your brain wants progress, but only under conditions it can survive. And when those conditions improve, when respect returns, when agency is restored, the quitting voice softens.
Learning resumes.
Not because you became stronger, but because you stopped fighting your own biology. A different kind of hope. Hope is usually sold as something loud. Big dreams. Fresh starts. Dramatic change. But after everything that happened in these 3 weeks, marriage tension, quiet realizations, emotional overload, slow English practice, I learned a different definition of hope. A quieter one. One that doesn't shout, but stays. It arrived unexpectedly, on a normal morning.
No breakthroughs. No apologies.
Just breakfast on the table. The kids talking. A decision being discussed. And for the first time in a while, the conversation waited for me. Not long. Just long enough. That pause felt like hope. Not the kind that promises everything will be easy. The kind that says, you are still here.
You still matter.
Hope, it turns out, is deeply practical. Psychologists describe hope not as optimism, but as perceived pathways. The belief that there are small, realistic steps forward, and that you're allowed to take them. Equality in marriage creates those pathways. Without equality, hope collapses into endurance. And endurance, without meaning, burns people out. I stopped asking whether my marriage was good or bad. That question leads nowhere. Instead, I ask something more useful. Is this relationship becoming more equal than it was yesterday? That question allows progress without perfection. The same applies to English learning. Most people quit not because they don't improve, but because improvement feels disconnected from their life. Vocabulary lists don't fix loneliness. Grammar drills don't restore dignity. But language, when tied to real experience, can become something else entirely. It can become a tool for presence. Over these weeks, my English didn't suddenly become fluent. But it became honest. And honesty changed how it felt in my body. When language aligns with lived experience, the brain integrates it faster. This is supported by embodied cognition research. Learning sticks when it's grounded in physical and emotional reality. I started trusting slow progress again. I trusted that my children were learning, not from my perfection, but from my boundaries. I trusted that my marriage didn't need grand gestures, just consistent respect. I trusted that my brain wasn't broken, just tired. and that trust softened everything. Hope grew not because problems disappeared, but because I stopped disappearing inside them. If you're watching this while feeling stuck, in English, in marriage, in family life, let me say this clearly. You are not failing because you're slow. You are slow because you're carrying a lot. And carrying a lot requires compassion, not pressure. Hope is allowing yourself to take up space again, to speak slowly, to pause, to say, "This matters to me," even if your voice shakes. Especially then. Equality in marriage doesn't mean balance every day. It means repair is possible. It means conversations can be revisited. It means children grow up seeing adults who adjust, not dominate. That's real hope. The kind that lasts beyond motivation. As for English, let it grow alongside your life, not against it. Use it to name your reality, to express your boundaries, to tell your story imperfectly. Because when language becomes an extension of self-respect, it stops being a burden. It becomes a bridge. I don't know exactly where this journey leads. But I know this. I no longer confuse silence with peace, speed with strength, or quitting with failure. And that clarity, that quiet, grounded clarity, is enough to keep going. One slow sentence at a time.